The room was quiet, too quiet. Prince William sat frozen as Queen Camilla unfolded a letter written in his father's final days. No one spoke. No one breathed. And then came the words that shattered the silence. "Let Catherine carry the crown beside William. The monarchy's future rests in her strength." William's eyes filled instantly. It wasn't just about duty. It was about love, about trust, about legacy passed not through power, but through heart. Camilla's voice cracked. The past collided with the present, and in that moment, the prince didn't feel royal. He felt like a son, finally seen by his father. A room filled with silence. The drawing room at Sandringham was still. Afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting golden streaks across the carpet. Prince William sat motionless, sensing something was coming. Something that didn't belong in royal briefings or public statements. Across from him sat Queen Camilla, her hands wrapped tightly around a letter. The paper trembled, but not from the drafty windows. From something else, something final. The letter bore King Charles's personal seal. Camilla didn't speak at first. She took a long breath and unfolded the pages slowly, her fingers hesitant. Then, finally, her voice broke the silence. "Let Catherine carry the crown beside William. The monarchy's future rests in her strength." The words weren't protocol. They weren't planned. They were a father's final truth, wrapped in ink. William didn't blink. He just stared ahead, his breathing suddenly shallow. And then, as if the words had caught up with him all at once, his eyes welled. His shoulders dropped. He broke down, quietly, fully. It wasn't the burden of succession that broke him. It was the unexpected grace. His father hadn't asked him to carry it all. He had asked him to share it with her. This wasn't about titles. It was about legacy, survival, and love. Camilla's voice faltered again as she read on. The room, once still, now throbbed with emotion. There was no press, no witnesses beyond the walls. But in that quiet room, something massive had just shifted. A father's trust passed on. King Charles had made a choice, and he made it in a way few expected. He didn't deliver the words himself, not in a final meeting, not through a broadcast. He chose to send them through Camilla, a woman who knew more about royal tension, public scrutiny, and unspoken grief than most would ever admit. The decision wasn't about convenience. It was intentional. Charles had watched Catherine for years, not just as William's wife, but as the unwavering spine of the modern monarchy. She had navigated press storms, personal health battles, and motherhood, all while holding the royal family together like quiet scaffolding. He had seen her during the pandemic, steadying the family with grace. He had seen her while he was ill, her visits, her strength, her restraint. And he'd remembered the chaos of his own youth, the fractures, the noise. Catherine was the opposite of all of it. In his final months, Charles grew more introspective. And when it came time to write down the future, not just of the institution but of his son's heart, he didn't think of hierarchy. He thought of survival. He thought of the monarchy not as a throne, but as a house. And Catherine, standing in its quietest, strongest corner. He had written, "She is not beside him, she is with him, and the difference matters." That was his parting gift to William, not a title, a partner. And William, already burdened by duty, suddenly felt something he hadn't felt in months. relief. Because this wasn't just a crown passed down, it was trust. And not just in him, in her. Camilla's breaking point. She tried to read it all, but by the final paragraph, Camilla's voice cracked. She held back tears as long as she could, but the weight of the words and the shadows they summoned finally broke through. She folded the letter slowly, then looked up at William with eyes she could no longer keep dry. "He loved you both," she said softly. Then after a pause, her voice dropped lower, almost like a confession. But Catherine reminded him of Diana. Quiet grace, relentless strength. The words echoed through the air like wind through an open corridor. Undeniable, unanswerable. Camilla looked away, blinking fast. For years, she had stood in the long shadow of Diana, smiling, working, enduring. But now, that shadow wasn't just behind her. It was speaking. Through Charles. Through Catherine. Through memory. She rose from her seat gently, placed the folded letter on the table, and whispered, "I need a moment." She left the room before tears could fall in full view. No one followed. Because even in a family as public as the Royals, there are moments that belong to no cameras. Only the heart. Camilla's breaking point wasn't bitterness. It was honesty, vulnerability. The realization that no matter how far she had come, Diana's spirit still held the room. And as she disappeared down the corridor, her steps quieter than before, William remained seated, face wet, hands still, heart full. What had begun as a reading of a father's wish had become something else entirely. A reckoning. And maybe the start of healing. Diana's hidden letter resurfaces. It happened quietly, without cameras, headlines, or fanfare, just days before King Charles's final letter would shake the monarchy. A palace archivist, sorting through an old mahogany drawer in a rarely used room deep inside Kensington Palace, stumbled across something curious. It wasn't in a file. It wasn't labeled. It was tucked beneath old stationery, hidden where only time could find it. A single sealed envelope. Its color was faded cream, but the handwriting was clear, soft, slanted, unmistakable. It carried a presence. To William, it read on the front. No date, no explanation. But on the back, a signature that froze the room. Diana. The staff member who found it didn't speak. He simply carried it down the corridor, hand shaking slightly, and delivered it directly to William's private aide. There were no formalities, just a quiet knock, a silent nod. And then it was in William's hands. The moment he saw the writing, he stopped breathing. His chest tightened. His fingers trembled. He didn't have to ask who it was. "It's Mum," he whispered, barely audible, like the word itself might disappear if spoken too loudly. He didn't open it, not immediately, not even after the room cleared. He simply held it for hours. From room to room, in total silence, the letter never left his hands. He stared at the seal. He ran his thumb across the ink. It was as if the envelope might speak, if only he stayed still long enough to hear it. Because this wasn't just a forgotten letter. This was a lost heartbeat. A voice he hadn't heard in nearly 30 years, suddenly returned in ink and paper. A message she'd left not for the world, not for the crown, but for him. William didn't tell anyone. He didn't alert press or palace officials. He just slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, where it rested against his chest. Like armor, like memory, like love. As the evening light faded outside the palace walls, he stepped into the dusk, alone, not to read it, but to feel it. Because whatever the letter said, however it was meant to be opened, this moment wasn't about answers. It was about presence, about knowing, without question, that she was still with him. Not just in legacy, but in a sealed envelope that had waited patiently until he was ready. And as the wind picked up through the palace gardens, William stood still, hand resting over his heart, knowing that he wasn't alone anymore. William reads his mother's words. That night, under the vast Norfolk sky, William walked alone toward a place no one else would think to look. Past the hedgerows, beyond the garden lights of Anmer Hall, to the old tree he used to climb as a child, a place where he had once felt free. There were no guards, no cameras, no security detail, just the quiet crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the sound of wind weaving through the branches above. In his pocket, the letter weighed more than paper ever should. It had waited nearly 30 years. He sat at the base of the tree, the bark rough against his back, and pulled his coat tight against the chill. Then, with shaking hands, he opened the envelope. Carefully, slowly, as if the paper might fall apart under the weight of what it carried. And then, her words. Diana's voice came alive, not through audio, not through memory, but through ink, neat, careful, unmistakably hers. A mother speaking across time. The letter wasn't filled with protocol or palace expectations, or any of the language the monarchy so often buried feelings behind. It was human, raw, real, a mother writing to her son with no filter, no agenda, just love. She spoke about believing in his heart, about not letting duty drown out instinct, about watching over him when the world grew too loud. But one line hit harder than all the rest. One sentence, small and quiet, but thunderous in meaning. Stay close, don't let the world pull you apart. He read it again, and again, letting each word fall into place like a memory clicking into position. It was a warning, maybe about the press, maybe about the pressures of royal life. But deep down, William knew she was talking about Harry. The tears came fast, uncontrolled. Not the kind spilled during public mourning or ceremonial grief. These were boyhood tears, the kind that had been locked away behind royal posture and stoic smiles. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a future king, not as a figurehead, but as a son, a brother, a human being. Her love had found him, not as a memory, but as a compass, clear, direct, undeniable. By the time he folded the letter again, careful not to smudge a single word, he wasn't the same man who had walked out into the night. He wasn't lost anymore. He was guided by the only voice that had ever truly understood the boy behind the burden. And in that moment, under that ancient tree, Diana came home. Charles reads Diana's letter too. The next day, William approached his father. He didn't speak at first. He simply handed the letter over, Diana's letter, his hands careful, reverent. King Charles hesitated. His fingers touched the paper like it might burn. Then, slowly, he opened it. The room was silent, but alive with unspoken emotion. Charles read line by line. His brow furrowed, his shoulders tensed, and then his expression cracked. Somewhere between the first memory and the last plea, the king's face softened into grief. His hand trembled. He reached the line about their sons, about unity, about love that stretched beyond royal walls, and then he whispered, She still knows how to find us." It was the first time in years the two men sat together, not as monarch and heir, but as father and son. No cameras, no protocol, just silence, remembrance, and a shared ache they never quite dared to speak aloud. And in that quiet hour, with Diana's voice filling the space between them, something once broken began to bend. Not back to what it was, but towards something new. They didn't speak much after, but they didn't need to. Because sometimes, the healing begins not with words, but with finally hearing the ones you've been waiting for all your life. The message to Harry. The letter had done more than stir memory. It had reawakened something deeper. Not just grief, but duty. Not royal duty, but emotional obligation. William, holding his mother's final words close, felt a quiet fire rising inside him. It wasn't urgency. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier. A truth that could no longer be ignored. Diana hadn't written that letter to him alone. She had written it to both her sons. And her plea had been heartbreakingly simple. Stay close. Don't let the world pull you apart. But the world had already done just that. Through headlines, through distance, through silence that hardened into years. Still, the letter offered something rare now. A bridge, fragile, unspoken, but sacred. William didn't reach for his phone. He didn't type out a message or ask for a video call. He knew this moment deserved more. So he did it the old way, the royal way. He called upon a trusted aide and handed them a handwritten note, sealed without a crest. No commentary, no explanation, just 5 words. Tell him she wrote to both of us. No judgment, no bitterness, just truth. Hours later, thousands of miles away, in Montecito, Harry received the envelope. There was no ceremony, no media briefing, no cameras, just a quiet knock and a delivery placed gently in his hands. At first, he thought it was another official update. But then he saw it. The handwriting, instantly recognizable, slanted, elegant, alive with memory. His mother's. His fingers trembled. He didn't move for a full minute. Then, slowly, he walked to the garden. Alone. No one followed. He sat beneath a tree and opened the letter. The paper unfolded like a whisper from the past. The ink hadn't faded. Neither had the emotion. Diana's words poured across the page. Not about royalty, not about titles, but about love, about unity, about 2 boys she feared might grow apart under the weight of the very institution she once tried to navigate herself. One line stopped him cold. Don't let the world pull you apart. Harry's vision blurred. His shoulders shook. And then, for the first time in years, he cried, not with anger, not with regret, but with recognition. She remembered everything, he whispered through the California air. That night, barefoot in the cool grass, he held the letter to his chest. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call William. Not yet. But something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of possibility. Because Diana hadn't asked them to fix the world, or the crown, or even their public image. She had only asked them to remember who they were. Brothers, before anything else. Queen Camilla in tears. The palace halls were quiet, but not empty. Whispers floated like echoes, soft, fast, and impossible to ignore. Staff spoke in half-sentences. Glances were exchanged. Doors were left slightly ajar. And through those whispers came one name, Diana. The same name that had haunted headlines, shaped public opinion, and carved an unshakable figure into the soul of the monarchy. One whisper made it to Queen Camilla, alone in her sitting room. It wasn't an official statement. It wasn't announced with ceremony. It came in a hushed voice between two aides in the hallway, unaware she was listening. A letter had surfaced. Diana's letter, meant for both sons, meant to be read. And worse, meant to be felt. Camilla's hand froze mid-air, her tea untouched. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Her eyes slowly closed, and for a moment, she let herself feel it. Not jealousy, not resentment, just the crushing weight of being second, even after all this time. Diana's ghost had always been present. In oil paintings, in charity galas, in tabloid comparisons she no longer read. But this time, it wasn't nostalgia. This time, it was personal. This time, Diana had returned in ink, in voice, in truth. Camilla sat back, her breath shallow, her hands clenched, her shoulders trembled. "I've tried so hard to belong," she whispered into the silence. "But she still commands hearts." She didn't say it in anger. She said it like someone finally admitting defeat. Because no matter how many appearances she made, no matter how dutifully she stood beside Charles during the reign, she had never truly been embraced. And now the woman the world refused to forget had come back not just to be remembered, but to lead the next chapter. Through Catherine. Through her sons, not through Camilla, but in spite of her. Tears began to fall, not fast, but steady. Not loud, but heartbreaking. Camilla didn't attend dinner that night. She didn't speak to Charles. She kept the curtains drawn. She sat in the hush of royal grandeur, feeling like a guest in a kingdom she was never fully allowed to own. Because legacy, it turns out, isn't written in crowns or carriages. It isn't sealed in titles or ceremonies. It's written in the hearts that never stop remembering, and in the ones that still refuse to let go. And that night, Camilla realized she hadn't lost to scandal. She had lost to memory. And memory, when it loves someone deeply enough, never lets them leave. The palace reels in silence. Everything inside the palace looked the same. The floors still shined, the portraits still watched, the uniforms still marched. But something underneath it all had shifted, and everyone could feel it. It was like the walls themselves had begun to listen. Prince William withdrew first. He quietly canceled appearances without explanation. No interviews, no handshakes, no balcony waves. He stayed home, not as a prince, but as a man clinging to the quiet truth of a mother's words. That letter, folded gently, worn at the edges, remained untouched on his nightstand. Not because he feared it, but because he already lived by it. King Charles, too, began to change. Not in policy or power, but in presence. He no longer spoke like a monarch preparing for the next chapter. He spoke like a father, less rehearsed, more real. His public addresses became fewer, and when he did speak, staff noticed. The voice was slower, softer, sometimes almost uncertain. The palace noticed. Aides moved with more hesitation. Jokes were rare. Schedules changed without warning. And beneath all of it, Diana's name, though never said aloud, lingered like incense in the corridors. Even Queen Camilla, always composed, moved differently. She walked quieter, looked down more often. Her posture remained regal, but her gaze avoided connection. as if any glance might betray what was really there. Grief, memory, maybe guilt. Staff whispered, but not about scandals. They whispered about moods, about glances, about how the energy felt thicker, like a storm had passed, but its scent remained. It wasn't chaos, it was conscience. A reckoning that didn't tear the walls down, but made everyone inside them pause. Because for years, the institution had focused on structure, optics, and tradition. It had buried pain under protocol. It had asked its family members to wear duty like armor, even when they were bleeding inside. But now, that armor had cracked, and through it spilled something the crown rarely made space for. Real emotion, unspoken apologies, fragile beginnings. Because Diana's letter, though wrapped in the past, wasn't a relic. It was a mirror, a map, a message of what could still be repaired. And in the silence that followed, the question was no longer about survival. The monarchy would endure. That was never in doubt. The real question, the one no crown could answer, was this: could the family inside the palace finally become whole again? Not by erasing what came before, but by finally facing it. A future shaped by her words. The letter was folded once more, neatly, and placed in the drawer beside William's bed. He didn't reread it that day, not because he didn't want to, but because he already knew it by heart. Every word, every line, every syllable etched now into the way he walked, spoke, led. Diana's voice was no longer a memory. It was a compass. He returned to work slowly, but something had changed. He didn't walk like a prince preparing to be king. He walked like a son carrying a promise. He began calling Harry more often, quietly, without press, without pressure. He began deferring more to Catherine, letting her step into the light, not as his consort, but as his equal, as the woman Diana always hoped he'd find. And he smiled differently now. Not often, but when he did, it felt real, like something had finally settled. The crown hadn't healed them. The past hadn't broken them. Her words had saved them. Diana didn't live to see her sons grow into men. But in that letter, she gave them what time never could: a way back, a reason to try, and a future that would be shaped not by protocol, but by love that never left. William stood, letter in hand, tears still fresh, but his gaze steady. His father had spoken, and the message was clear. This was Catherine's time, not just beside him, but with him. And as the future king looked toward what's next, he finally understood. The crown's strength now lives in her.